I was just talking to Mel Hardy from the IRS, and he reminded me that this is the 10th celebration of EITC Awareness Day, and I know a lot of people, it was a surprise to me. I know it's been around, but you never step back and think about, wow, it's the 10th year that we celebrated this important day. Now, I know EITC Awareness Day doesn't roll off the tongue like Merry Christmas or Happy Hanukkah or things like that, but it's a really great day this year to celebrate the EITC. And it's really great to celebrate the EITC, the CTC, the ALTC, all the tax credits for working families this year, because we had a huge victory in December. Yes, absolutely. We can clap that up. And you'll hear more about what that victory was, but as we talk today, but we're going to celebrate in the way the true wonks do, which is with stimulating conversation and debate. So we're going to move forward with that today. Before I go any further, I do want to just do a quick housekeeping. If you're live tweeting the event, please use the hashtag, and our social media person will kill me if I don't do it, so I'm doing it now. EITC 16. And with that, we'll get started. First of all, I want to thank Lauren Pescator of Tax Credits for Working Families for co-sponsoring this event with us. My name is Jeremy Greer. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Research at CFED. And for those of you that don't know who CFED is a nonprofit organization that really focuses on expanding and moving forward what we call an opportunity economy, and an economy in which people can save, invest, are financially secure, and have access to the tools and ability to advance economically. I also want to thank Senator Sherrod Brown. One, he's not here today, so he doesn't hear my thanks, but his staff are here, and that's important. But I want to thank him, one, because he was the hard charger and the leader around the victories that we had in December. And he got us his room, which means we wouldn't be sitting here or standing here were it not for his staff. So I want to give a round of applause to Senator Sherrod Brown. So the reason we celebrate today is that these tax credits, we know, are critically important to the economic lives of low and moderate income families. We know that, one, because you're going to hear that from a esteemed group of experts, but we also know that because of the experiences of people in communities that are accessing these credits, to people that are helping those people access these credits, and that's been documented over many years, and you'll hear some of that documentation today. CFED has been fortunate to coordinate what's called a Tax Opportunity Network, or TON, and that is a coalition of 700 organizations and individuals that are bound together in this fight through working through the volunteer income tax assistance program. And that is a program that provides tax services to low-income families across the country so that they can access these vital resources. So we're going to kick this off today in the place that we should always kick off policy discussions. This is a thing that CFED is rooted in our beliefs, and that's with research. You're going to hear very soon from Professor Catherine Eden. She's going to lead us off and talk about two of her books, two books that are really seminal. It's Not Like I'm Poor and $2 a Day. And these are two books that have really framed how we think and really given voice to the experiences of low-income families. We're also going to hear from Ellen Niesenbaum. Ellen works for an institution, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, CBPP, and they were really the leaders in moving forward the advances that we saw in December, and she'll talk to you again more about those. And then you're going to hear from Senator Booker. So when Senator Booker isn't digging people out of snow, He is an advocate for working families across the country. You're going to have an opportunity to hear from him about how important this work is. And then finally, you're going to hear from an esteemed panel of people, which I won't introduce. That'll be the job of our moderator, Dylan Matthews from VOTS. But I'm going to close to really just talk about the themes that we want to touch on today. You know, one of those themes that we talked about is really understand the breadth of the legislative victory that we saw in December and why that's so important to working families. But more importantly, we want to talk about what's next. You know, what are we going to do next? And the speakers are going to talk about an array of proposals that are going to really move things forward. For example, you know, while they don't agree on much, Speaker Ryan and President Obama have both talked about the importance of expanding the EITC to childless workers. In a survey recently by Intuit and the Center for Social Development, it was found, and you'll hear hopefully more about this research on the panel, that tax time is a great moment to improve savings in families. And then finally, we know from years and years of research that we got a lot to do as it comes to higher education credits and the impact that they can have on families. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to introduce our first speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Catherine Eden. She is, as I mentioned, the author of two important and seminal books, It's Not Like I'm Poor and $2 a Day. Through these books, they presented mounds of data, but more importantly, vivid real-life stories that really illustrate the struggles and the resilience of low-income families and how they use resources like the Earned Income Tax Credit. So with that, again, happy EITC Awareness Day, and I'll welcome Professor Catherine Eden.
I'd like to start by crediting my co-authors. Finding brilliant young people to research and write with is probably my biggest secret trick. So Luke Schaefer, co-author of $2 a Day, Sarah Halpern-Meek and Jen Sykes and Laura Tack, co-authors on It's Not Like I'm Poor. It was really fascinating to publish two books in the same year on two faces, really, of welfare reform. One, the tremendous success of a program that really supports the effort of single mothers and working families who can manage to find full-time, full-year work, albeit at low wages. And the other, really, of the failure of the safety net to catch those who don't manage to find full-time, full-year work when they fall. But I want to start by painting a picture. And in order to paint this picture, I need to take you to East Boston. Many of you know that this has long been sort of the Ellis Island of the Boston area. It's a working class community where you've probably visited when you landed at Logan Airport. It's a very vibrant community, but there on Maverick Street lies a Dickensian building. It takes about a half of a block. It's made out of brick, now encased with a century of grime. It has wire mesh in the windows. Over the door, in dirty brass letters, read the words, Overseers of the Public Welfare. Above that, there's a huge flagpole jutting, sans the flag these days. This is the location that for generations, people who sought aid from the government had to go in order to seek relief. And really the visage of this building speaks to the heritage of a program, the old AFDC program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, what we called welfare prior to welfare reform, a program that despite its good intentions tended to impose stigma, shame. When Laura Lane and I traveled the country hanging out with welfare recipients and in welfare offices, we often heard recipients complain that the workers who are, I don't mean to say that this is true, but the workers treated the money like it was their own. It was almost as if to claim relief from that system meant that you had to trade away your citizenship card, give up your dignity, in T.H. Marshall's words when he was writing about the poorhouse, to cross the road to the company of the destitute in order to participate in that program. I spent a lot of time, as I said, with Laura Lane, my co-author on my first book, Making Ends Meet, between 1989 and 1995, visiting welfare offices in Chicago, in Boston, in San Antonio, Texas, and in Charleston, South Carolina. So imagine my surprise when in 2008, I started hanging out at another kind of place. Now, about a mile from this Maverick Street location is a little commercial establishment on Bennington Street. Okay, if you would go there today and it had just snowed, you would see bright placards like campaign posters, poked into the snow. They would say things like, "Money in minutes," and "You've got people." And if you would enter the doors of this establishment, you would be greeted by a phalanx of friendly people waiting to serve you. Can anyone guess what this place is? The H&R Block. Now, H&R Block and its competitors are where 70% of EITC claimants go to get their refunds. Yes, they charge a pretty penny for their services, but walking through those doors, we learned as we interviewed and followed hundreds of EITC claimants, is like a badge of citizenship, right? Because you're doing something that every other American does. You're putting in your tax refund because you've worked during the year. You're not a dependent, you are a worker. And the way people talked about the experience of claiming the EITC versus the experience of claiming AFDC was simply stunning to me. People would often say, "You've got people," repeating the slogan that H&R Block was using in that year. They would say, "February, oh February," as if they were writing an ode to the month of February, which is, of course, when the Modal family collects its EITC. They would use phrases like "better than Christmas." Walmart has actually picked this up and now has a better than Christmas sale around February. They talked about feeling like real Americans. They identified strongly as workers. They even bragged and took pride in being taxpayers. Now, maybe none of us in this room are go around bragging about being taxpayers, but this was a very central part of their identity. Now, we're sociologists. We hang out with economists, and both sociologists and economists have said that it's really important to capture what different kinds of monies mean. And so in keeping with that, we asked people about what their tax credit meant to them. We found that people really saw it as a just reward for work, something they had earned. They believed that the more you work, the more you get from the program, so they saw it as work motivating, but also a just reward for their effort. Second, they saw it as the kids' money. They didn't understand the rules very well. It's certainly not enough to game the system. But they believed that the money was sort of a sacred trust because they knew it was associated with having children. And finally, they saw it as savings, special money that should be put aside for long-term financial goals, not the day-to-day bills that consumed their money, their budgets, in the rest of the year. So along with my collaborators, we followed several hundred EITC filers from the moment that they applied through 6 months' time to look at how they spent the money. And what we saw was really striking. First, spending was very much in accordance with that meaning. 10% was reserved for the kids. One mother talked about how she actually let the kids go to Target and pick out one outfit that they really wanted rather than the sale outfit she would have gotten, and how this just brought such pleasure to her child. Another mother talked about an especially good child who had had a very hard year and how she bought her a little Dora the Explorer table and chair so she can sit and have her after-school snack at that table. But 40% was reserved for mobility purposes, 17% directly into savings, and the rest to things like used cars or deep freezers, washers and dryers, time-saving assets. 25% went toward cleaning up debt, often precisely because families wanted to clean up their credit so they could look ahead and save, hopefully, for a home. 2% to tax prep, and much of the rest went to paying ahead on bills, kind of building some surplus into the future. But even more important than how they spent the money, because you might expect that they would squander the money, such a big lump sum, was how it made them feel like real Americans. Now, two of my favorite political scientists are Joe Soss and Andrea Campbell, and I commend their work to you on both on Social Security and AFDC. But if their results are correct, and we have yet to test this, there may be all kinds of positive externalities to a program that makes people feel more included, more part of the American fabric. Again, the Soss and Campbell results suggest that we should see more voting and higher rates of civic engagement. And if these positive externalities are real, this could help heal our communities and even strengthen our nation. Now, the EITC is not quite perfect. There is a small flaw, and that is when we cataloged the budgets of folks over the entire year, what we saw is that in the typical month, the average family was still living in the red, and that's part of why 25% of EITC expenditures went toward debt. Now, we also know that families hated the idea of an advanced EITC. They really liked the lump sum. Many actually intentionally overwithhold to jack up that lump sum. So we need to figure out a way to preserve the good of the lump sum, but also build the power of the credit to smooth income in the face of a rainy day. And we're going to be talking about that today. Last year at about this time, I had the pleasure to meet Ezra Levin from CFED, and he and myself, Sarah Halpern-Meakin, Sarah Sternberg-Green, have come together to really advance a policy proposal we call the Rainy Day EITC. And again, I'd like to repeat the result in closing from the Center for Social Development. When asked EITC filers whether they would take advantage of a program that would allow them to save a portion of their refund with a modest match, 82% indicated they would like to take advantage of such a program. We have a lot of work to do, but this is an exciting result, and I look forward to our discussion.
Come back up, I want to introduce Ellen Niesenbaum. As I mentioned earlier, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities was a key stakeholder in moving forward the victories that we experienced in December, and we wanted to have Ellen here to really talk about those victories and in depth about what they were and what we should think about moving forward. Ellen is an experienced policy expert. She's been working on issues related to the EITC for many years. I'll be polite and not say them. But she's done things like coordinated the first EITC outreach and education campaign, and she's just led effort after effort, really focusing on making sure that working families get a fair shake when they go in and do their taxes, as Catherine said, live up their civic duty. So with that, I will introduce Ellen Niesenbaum.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you so much for having me. Let me start by thanking CFED for their incredibly important contributions to this campaign. We are still, I think, soaring high over this major victory in December and making these critical improvements permanent. It certainly would not have happened without the work of CFED, but I would imagine that there are many representatives here from organizations and members of Congress without whom this also wouldn't have happened. So without knowing all of you in the room, I'm sure that the Center owes all of you a big debt of thanks. Let me specifically just thank Senator Brown in absentia. This certainly would not have happened without Sherrod Brown, and I really want to echo those comments. But for those of you that have not seen it, in the ultimate testament to the Energizer Bunny that Senator Brown is, he did a terrific floor statement yesterday about the victories, but also about what the next steps are. And I think the partnership of Senator Brown and Senator Booker on this are important. And so if you haven't read the floor statement, it's a terrific thing to read from yesterday. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that come from this victory, some of the policy implications, and particularly one or two things that we really haven't made public about the profound impact of this. So I think all of you know that these EITC provisions were first established. In fact, the Center did a lot of work to help design them in 2009 in the Great Recession, the beginning of the Great Recession, when the administration and a bipartisan group of congressional leaders were looking for provisions that would affect a number of things. And one of the main goals was to mitigate the degree to which people fell into poverty or deeper into poverty, as well as to provide very effective economic stimulus, big bang for the buck. And obviously there was a lot of work on unemployment and SNAP, but EITC and the CTC were right up there. And that was the beginning of these temporary provisions. And as you know, they were extended a number of times and ultimately were set to expire in 2017. So if you go back to the end of last year, even the beginning of 2015, not a lot of focus was on why we needed to make the provisions that didn't expire in 17 permanent in 15. One of the things that really happened over the last year, and really over the last 2 years from Dr. Eden and others, is that there has been a lot of research about the EITC itself over time, but we've really got the gift of tremendous validation on the improvements themselves. So just so you know, the improvements will continue to raise 16 million people out of or closer to the poverty line, including 8 million children. But 50 million Americans will benefit from these improvements. 50 million Americans, including 25 million children. And what is often not known about the EITC and the accompanying child tax credit is if you think about these two things together, they lift more kids out of poverty than any program in the federal government. And not only do they lift them out of poverty, they put them or help put many of them on a trajectory that improves their life over time. And that was an amazing piece of research that I think was tremendously persuasive with a wide array of bipartisan legislators this year. So this, over the last year or two, Kathy knows the research much better than I do, we've really seen long-term studies about the impact of investing in the EITC because it's been around long enough now that we're starting to have research, not just, by the way, on programs like EITC, but SNAP and Medicaid that show the long-term benefits of those programs. So just to remind you of a few, and I have to say even at the center, our whole crew of policy wonks was pretty surprised by some of this. For example, reduced incidence of low birth weight, improved maternal health, not the kinds of things you would normally expect from an EITC. Improved educational outcomes, we kind of expected that. Significant improvement in college attendance. Higher lifetime earnings for those kids who were in families when they benefited from the EITC. And that talks a lot about proving the economic stability and mobility of families that benefit from this. Now, I think a lot of people know that the EITC is a very powerful work incentive, and with the refundable part of the child tax credit, that is equally true, and those were strengthened in the improvements as well. It's worth remembering that when we went through welfare reform in the 90s, that it was the EITC improvements of that decade that got more single moms to move from welfare to work than welfare reform did itself. Another thing that I think helped really build very significant bipartisan support for these policies. And I think one of the things that really helped a lot of us in this effort that we were very privileged and honored to help facilitate was showing the millions of Americans and of working Americans and kids who would fall into poverty if these improvements were not made permanent, and I think that really helped build the basis for what is really quite a rare bipartisan victory for working families. I also want to mention one other area, particularly for staff that may be in the room, and that is that one of the things that happened at the end of this long process, well, let me back up. In the very beginning of this year, we had numerous policymakers say to us, I really think the EITC is great, but what about that error rate? And so many of us did a tremendous amount of work. In fact, often people said to us, what about the fraud? And so we got to quote TICTA and IRS and all these other entities to show that it is overwhelmingly errors. Overwhelmingly errors, and in fact errors that come not just from families, often because of the complexity, but also some from some providers or paid preparers, but there was a very strong commitment to make the improvements permanent and to improve program integrity. And the package does that. So I really want to acknowledge the work of the bipartisan staff, of the tax committees, and the leadership who worked day and night towards the end of the process to put together a program integrity package to reduce overpayments in the EITC and the CTC. As Kathy, I think, has taught all of us, these families are complicated. They're multi-generational, things change. And frankly, having worked on the EITC since 1984, we've put in a lot of rules to try to make sure that it was going to the right people. Those rules make it more complicated, not less. The package, we are hopeful, will improve the program integrity, and it will reduce the overpayments under one condition. And that is that a lot of the things that were provided to the IRS, the tools and the resources, the tools and the mechanisms they have and the procedures are going to require resources. We know that when we invest in programs and program integrity, we've seen this in other programs, that you have to spend a little money to save a little money. So for those of you that are here from the policymaker world, it is really important to understand that the success of the program integrity part of the package depends on Congress providing resources to the IRS to implement that package. We don't want to come back years later and not see that error rate come down simply because the IRS wasn't given the resources. In some ways, I think about what was really about 18 months of work for all of us to get this across the finish line. And if I had to think about that classic, what's your elevator story success? If you had to pick one thing that takes you less than 3 minutes to explain, I think I would say that sometimes I think the victory came down to a story that a fact, but a story that my colleague Chuck Marr at the center came up with as a way to convey to policymakers and to the media what was at stake if these improvements were not made permanent. So we like to tell the story about the mom that works full-time year-round, minimum wage with 2 kids. She benefited from the child tax credit, the refundable part, and the improvement that was done in 2009 by getting $1,700 in the child tax credit. If the improvement had not been made permanent, that mother would have lost every single dollar of her child tax credit, and she and her family would have been plunged into poverty. That is a pretty dramatic way of talking about what has been won here. But here's the bottom line, and you haven't seen this on a center website or a paper, but it is something that we were able to determine with some evaluation and research after the fact. If you look at the number of people lifted out of poverty or closer to the poverty line just by the improvements, not by the underlying credits, just by the improvements alone, and then you look at the purchasing power put in the pocketbooks of these families, this legislation is the biggest anti-poverty reduction outside of the ACA in 20 years. That is a profound, profound victory. So on that note, I have more to say, but let me recognize all of you and all of the work that you did. That is just an amazing thing to do. Now, there is always the good news and the bad news, or the victory that is not 180% of what we wanted. So I do want to note the one disappointment that I know many of us, and especially Senator Booker and Senator Brown have, and that is that there were very significant efforts to have a second part of the tax package for working families, and that is to expand the very tiny earned income tax credit that was set up in 1993 for low-wage working adults not raising children. I want to be clear, we have to come up with a better name. We sometimes shorthand it in the center and calling it the childless adults. These, in fact, many of whom these are parents. It could be a married couple, it could be a mom whose kids are older, it could be a non-custodial father who's paying child support. So when we started talking to policymakers last year about the fact that there is one group in the entire country that is virtually taxed into poverty or deeper into poverty by federal taxes, it is this group. And I would still venture to say that that is not widely understood among policymakers across the Hill. So there was an effort to expand that. We are incredibly excited about the fact that this is a proposal that Speaker Ryan and President Obama have touted. You heard about it in the South Carolina Poverty Forum. And the idea is not just to expand the credit, but of particular interest is reducing the age threshold from 25 to 21 and what that means for young people who are trying to get a toehold into the economy. and particularly for those that are only able to get very low-wage jobs.
Any questions for the two of them? And there are mics here and here, so right there. If you could state who you are, where you're from, and then your question.
I'm Gary Moore. I'm a consultant. I'm wondering how many people are affected by this, and how many people are removed from poverty out of the total. I mean, the whole program. Not
the whole program. Right. Kathy probably knows better. It's about 9 million people that benefit. I don't know the numbers of those that are fully lifted. Again, remember the EITC, a lot of these families get both, not all, a lot get both. So sometimes we look at the anti-poverty effect of both. It is both a matter of lifting them out of poverty, but some, I want to be clear, lift them closer to the poverty line. Right. But Kathy probably knows the figures better than I do.
Yeah, so I talked about having written these two books showing the two faces of welfare reform. There are actually three, and they're roughly equal, interestingly enough. So about 3.2 million children at last count, I believe in 2013, were lifted completely out of poverty just by the EITC, not counting the child tax credit. About 2.8 million children at any given time remain on TANF. And about 3.4 million children in the course of a year will spend at least 3 months living in a household on cash incomes of less than $2 per person per day. So we see deep poverty among, the EITC is great for people who can claim full-time, full-year work, and we have to, families have really made that now their mental goal. That's very encouraging, but the economy hasn't been fully cooperative, especially for those with barriers to work. So we do have sort of the ugly underbelly here of this extremely poor group, but yet even among that group, only 10% claim TANF, and about 70% work in the formal labor market over the course of a year. So, in some ways, everybody is, all of the poor, the vast majority of the poor who are families with children, are now the working poor. And it's incumbent upon us to support their efforts to play by the rules and engage fully as citizens through work.
Any other questions out there? Oh, there.
Hi, good morning, thanks. Tom Malloy, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Ellen, you spoke about the childless worker credit and the failure to get that, and that's the next phase. Is there good research, or at least good models, that show childless workers receiving this credit would be more inclined to form families because financial instability is, it seems like there's a research gap, or maybe I'm just ignorant of it.
There is some research. Again, I'm afraid to say a word beyond that with Miss EITC sitting next to me. So I will just say a word and then turn to Kathy. There is a growing body of research. There's a body of research, but there are also, Tom, really important policy experts around the country that are beginning to think about not so much the evidence that we've seen, but very strong reason to believe that the EITC for childless adults, if expanded, would have certain effect. I went back yesterday, I had never done this before, and I looked at all of the language and statements from Speaker Ryan when he introduced the legislation, and then everybody who talked about this at the Poverty Forum. So Speaker Ryan, Jeb Bush, a number of others. Obviously, there are a number of folks at AEI that talk about this. And there are 3 or 4 things they talk about, and one of them is very much promoting, some of them believe it will promote marriage. There's a lot of discussion about the stability of families. I'm going to say in a minute about the connection here between criminal justice, but also Speaker Ryan and others, one of the reasons they're very interested in this is they talk about the very strong work incentive nature of the credit for families with kids. They believe that the childless adult EITC will equally have a strong work incentive, especially if we can get the age down to age 21. But Kathy will know more about what
You're here.
Wow, look what I just pretended to be.
Very good, Ellen.
So, wow, okay, that was like the best introduction I've ever received in Washington. As sort of a junior freshman senator, you usually just get to stand in the way back and don't get such nice things said about you. But that means so much, especially coming from somebody, Ellen, who's the hero. It's sort of like Goliath, the giant, sort of giving some
help to the leprechaun. So thank you for those kind words, and to all the CFED family. This is really an inspiring organization that pumps me up tremendous. You were actually generous because it's often not done, where they talk about the senator down here. But please let me tell you the not so well kept secret. Staff does everything, and I just want Charlotte to stand up and you guys just give her a little bit of warmth. So in my end of the year wrap up, I asked my staff, what can we be doing better around here? And then after all these serious policy things, they say, and we'd like you to bring coffee to the office more. So I brought coffee this morning. We were in a little morning gaggle, and she comes up to me and just says, look, I've raised $34,000 for Flint, Michigan. And here with a New Jersey senator, and I was just so proud that amidst all her work, she's really trying to raise money to support us because we're all in this together. And that's really the theme I want to hit on real quick, because as I came in here and heard a little bit of the Q&A, you guys just made all the points I was going to make in my speech, so we'll throw this thing out. But this is the point I really want to make, and maybe I can make it in two ways by telling a little bit of my background. First is that since I was a teenager, I've been working with young people in inner city communities. When I was out at Stanford, I worked at a summer program in East Menlo Park, sort of the East Palo Alto, really tough town, tough community, ironically separated by the tracks by one of the wealthiest communities. Again, a testimony to the most ridiculous housing policy this country has ever had, that has really cemented in inequality, inequity, bigotry, and some of the lesser streams of American culture. But as I work with these kids at the end of a long summer, I was just really loved these children, and I decided to leave these. I was given boys ages 6 to 12, and I was trying to leave them with this inspiring message. And I was a football player at Stanford. Close your eyes and just envision me chiseled for a second. Now I just jiggle, but just please, for a second, imagine me back then and had a lush head of hair. And so I decided to try to inspire these kids with something I had heard in high school, which was this speaker who came to our high school students, and we were all sitting like you guys are, and we said, raise your hand as high as you can, and we all struggled to get our hands up as high as we could, and said, is it as high as you can? We said, yes. And he goes, now go 3 inches higher. And this, when we thought about it, when we had a goal, when we had a mission, we squeezed a little bit more. Some people just stood up and realized, hey, we can always do more. So gather these kids together to do the exact same thing. And I don't know how many people here work with kids on a regular basis, but I definitely do not have any advanced degrees in child psychology. All the kids just looked at me and basically said no, they said, oh, come on, man, it's late, it's tired. One kid, ever the enthusiast, raises his hand, and the other kids just jumped on. Put your hand down, you got BO, man, so put it down. And so now I've decided that I have to resort to a base form of persuasion, very well known in the town of Washington, probably, and it was called bribery. And I pulled out $5 and said $5 to the kid that can raise his hand the highest. And the other thing, if you work with children, you know that in this country of ours, regardless of background, all children have a base capitalistic instinct inside of them. And so as soon as they saw, President Lincoln staring at them, they got all excited, and their mental calculus, risk reward went there, and all their hands shot up. And now I feel this sense of smug satisfaction. I have now, my will has basically overcome their will. I felt they're strong, and I looked at them, and then unfortunately I saw over to my left this little kid named Robert, still remember his name, cute as can be. He's like a cross between a young Gary Coleman and Emmanuel Lewis, just so cute. But yet he was just looked down and frustrated, his arms crossed his face in a pout, and he was short. He could definitely not compete with all the other kids straining and putting their hands up for the $5. And so I was just going to walk over there and give him a little pity and sympathy. Hey, don't worry about it. This is just an exercise. And as soon as I started walking towards him, he turns around and little legs start motoring out of the gym. And I'm like, oh my God. And so I ran after him, and I caught him easily in 3 strides. And just picked this wiggling boy up. He's like, let me go. And I turn around and go, Robert, what's wrong? Where are you going? And he turns around, when I turn around, and he gives me this look that, like, with a wisdom that betrayed his age. And he said, let me go. And I said, why? He goes, you said you'd give $5 to the kid who could raise his hand the highest, right? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, let me go because I know a way to get to the roof. And I put this kid down, and I gave him the $5. And so let me just tell you right now, I have learned in my life that the greatest natural resource this country has is the genius of its children, the genius of its people. And the irony is, in this country, and we know that, by the way, this is not anything debated in the halls of Congress. We know that in a global knowledge-based economy, the most valuable resource you have is the genius of your people, the preparation for them to compete. And Americans are pretty good in competing. I mean, we've shown this generation after generation, but the problem is we're falling behind. And how are we falling behind? Well, we're falling behind by locking more and more of our children relative to our competitors in poverty. And it's dramatic. You know, looking at 35 developed countries in the United States, this country, 35 developed countries, our competitors, the US had the second highest proportion of its children living in poverty. That's an astonishing number in and of itself. But when you begin to look at the differences of what the outcomes are for children in poverty, and on top of that, you realize that the kids that are in poverty are disproportionately minority in this country, you begin to understand that we are stacking the deck against what is in our self-interest. Because the more kids that succeed, the more we all succeed. And so these outcomes are outrageous. Look at this. Kids in poverty, child growing up in poverty in the United States is 1.3 times more likely to develop a learning or developmental disability, undermining their economic potential and their contributions to the whole. This is a stunning data point. A child who grows up in poverty in the US has a 9 in 100 chance of attaining a college degree. 9 in 100 chance. And again, we used to be the #1 country in the globe for graduating kids from college and percentage of population. We were #1. Those chants we do during the Olympics, we're #1. That was the case in kids going out of college. Well, now we're no longer there. We're out of the top 10. And too often, a child growing up in poverty will not have the same access to other issues that are critical. For example, nutrition and having a good, healthy mind. For example, environmental contaminants. Please understand, poor kids, the #1 reason why kids miss school in America is asthma. Yeah. Poor kids have dramatically higher rates of asthma than kids that are not poor because of poor housing. It goes on and on. Because of enormous pressures kids face at home, stressors, environmental stressors, emotional stressors of poverty, stressors, and there's a whole lot of childhood trauma and PTSD growing up in the inner city for anybody that, like me, that lives there. And so our kids will, because of these stressors, fall grades behind their equivalent peers in school. By the time a teenage girl is in poverty, she will more likely to have an unplanned pregnancy. They're more likely to be involved with the criminal justice system. All of these things happen dramatically, the difference between a kid being in poverty or out of poverty. And so that's what, to me, the urgency of this is. Because kids out of poverty are incredibly productive. Kids out of poverty are make incredible contributions. And so the question for me always been is, what are the levers we have to pull? Now, Ellen, for crying out loud, stole my punchline about the fact that this is the best anti-poverty program. So I'm gonna have to trump her by doing my first ever imitation in Washington, D.C. in public of another famous Washington, D.C. official. So it is 2006. I've just been elected to mayor of the city of Newark. I'm taking over a city that has an incredibly high poverty rate. Taking over a city that is financially bankrupt, taking over a city on the edge, and my voters did not tell me this, elected in 2006, they did not warn me that in 2 years we would fall into the worst economy in 70 years. I think the voters should have given me a heads up that I'd have to govern under those conditions. And so I get a call from a guy saying, come up to Chappaqua and sit down with me. And so next thing you know, I'm driving up as a mayor-elect to go meet with Bill Clinton. And I'm thinking, okay, this guy is probably just going to tell me some stories and so on and so forth. And so we get in, and at first it's that he's showing me pictures on his wall. But then he sits down to me, pulls out data, and says to me, here goes now. This is being recorded, so I'm in trouble. This will live on YouTube forever. But he goes to me, Corey, I want to tell you right now that the best anti-poverty program that we came out of the federal government is the Earned Income Tax Credit. and thank you very much. One person. I've worked on that since 2006. 10 years of perfecting that. My staff now is hanging their head in shame. But then he started going through the data with me that unfortunately some of that data is still true. That not only is it the best way to get people out of poverty, but that we're leaving so much of that money on the table. Between 15 and 25%. In New Jersey, 20% of people that are eligible were leaving on the table. So he challenged me to set up free tax centers in Newark, and we did. Over a dozen EIT centers where people can get their taxes done. And for my almost 8 years as mayor, began to be the biggest exponent of getting more money. From our benchmark year, we more than doubled the amount of money we were getting in people's pockets. And the stories to me, every tax season, were blowing me away. I remember the White family lived in the South Ward of Newark, one of the poorer areas of our city. They were in financial distress. And we brought them not only out of poverty, but they got so many thousands of dollars back, because you can go back 3 years, that they were able to put a down payment on a home. They bought a 2-family home. So suddenly, instead of being renters in distress, they were owners renting, and suddenly they had financial stability and another source of income. Incredible stories like that of families just through this program making change. And so I became a believer and leaned in, and we did all kind of things through our work in Newark. We then realized that when people get $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 back, that we want to make sure that they leverage that money in every way possible. And so we created, thanks to a grant from some foundations, including Michael Bloomberg, who gave me my best political advice ever, which is before you become a mayor, Corey, you should become a billionaire. It's a brilliant political advice that I did not follow. But we created a savings match program to try to incentivize families to save that money. Because what we found out, and my staff and I are now working on with an incredible bipartisanship effort to try to find ways to incentivize through the EITC savings, is what we knew and we found out now is that most families who live on the financial margins cannot withstand a financial speed bump. Okay? Now, some of you all know exactly what I'm talking about. If I get a parking ticket, not that I've ever broken a parking law in my life. That was a joke for the camera. Booker lies. I think I broke some traffic infractions just walking here, I think, this morning. But for me, I'm going to pay the $100, $150, or $200. But for other folks, that financial speed bump now puts them in a bad situation where they're short on rent, where they can't buy food, where they're in peril. That's what we don't understand in our country, is how much of their margin. And then when you factor into that we have the most ridiculous, out of control criminal justice system, where 1 out of 3 Americans, adult Americans, has an arrest record, when municipalities are giving out fines and fees like crazy to try to make up on budgets that are fractured and broken and inadequate, you suddenly find a family that can get a $250 fine for something, can't pay it, then interest charges, and before you know it, they're losing their housing. They're losing their jobs because their car has been towed and they can't get it out. And so not having this cushion, this ability to withstand those financial speed bumps, often is the difference between homelessness and housing, feeding somebody and not, having a job or not having a job. Savings is a powerful thing. And so one of the things we're trying to do right now, we're exploring with Moran, is can we do that, something like that, to improve the EITC? Now we have had this has been one of the best moments for me, because people didn't understand this, and I have a victory dance which will never be seen in public, but I was doing my victory dance because I knew that the gains that we made in the EITC through this omnibus would be transformative for a lot of families. The gains that we made from lowering the income threshold for the CTC, transformative for families across this country. A higher credit for families with 3 or more kids, transformative in terms of the doors it'll open. Getting the marriage penalty reduction permanent, incredible. These are incredible gains, worthy of all of us right now pausing, standing up, and doing our versions of our victory dances, because this is how much of a meaningful change it will make. But we gotta go further. We have got to go further. And this misunderstanding that so many people have, that somehow kids, and I call them kids, but they are working adults, 21, 22, 23, 24, that they're not out there in dire straits, disconnected youth in our country, with heavy burdens, that these childless adults don't deserve the same opportunity. I did a victory dance for our legislation, but a lot of things in there were hard to stomach. That we were giving massive tax breaks in that same omnibus to incredible large financial institutions, banks, corporations, which, hey, I'm not one of these people that wants to carry a pitchfork and go raid every corporation in this country. That's just not my style. But I do understand that when you look at what creates a strong middle class in this country, especially if you understand that middle class wages for this generation, first generation of Americans, not to do better than our parents, because middle class wages have been stagnant, that the gains in economic growth have gone disproportionately to the wealthiest in our country, that we've got to start understanding what are we going to do to create opportunity for the youngest Americans. Because when you give young Americans, when you give struggling Americans, when you give the bottom quartile of Americans, when you give poor Americans tax credits, when you give them resources, that's an immediate boon to the economy. The EITC alone in New Jersey pumped over $1 billion into the New Jersey economy, which has a multiplier effect creating jobs. So if you tell me we have $1 billion in tax credits to give, where is it going to do the most stimulative effect to our economy? Giving it to the top 5% or the bottom 5%? Clearly, it's the bottom 5%. It will have a multiplier effect because most of those folks who get that money are spending it on urgent needs for their family and putting it into our economy. And so for me, the fact that we had this great success, worthy of a victory dance, but we were still giving these massive tax breaks to the top 5% and not taking that last step, which we pushed for and fought for, which was to expand for childless Americans, the EITC. That, to me, is problematic. And so just to finish up here, we have work to do. We have work to do. This is, to me, an organization and a group of folks fighting every day in the trenches, not for poor people, fighting for America. Fighting to understand that for every one of the people in this country, when we do better, we all do better. Fighting so that we don't have this terrible distinction on the globe for being one of the wealthiest nations who does the least for poor children. Fighting to make sure that we live out our creed and our ideals as a nation. I am going to be pounding the gospel over the coming month or two, given a chance with a book to go on, to poke my head up. I've been keeping this low profile, trying to down here, but I'm going to go out charging over the next a month or two to talk about this ideal, which I think is an American ethic, which I think is one of the most important American values, this ideal of interdependency, that we need each other. We are each other's hope and bond. We are each other's promise and possibility. I love the ideals of America that I hear exalted all the time of self-reliance and rugged individualism. I am all for that. And my mom and dad raised me to say, you've got to take care of yourself. You've got to work hard, be disciplined. If you want extraordinary results, you've got to put in extraordinary effort. But they were never, ever shy in telling me that I am here because of the extraordinary commitments of millions of Americans, from people who marched for me in the civil rights movement, who didn't even imagine that one day they would be making an impact on generations yet unborn. People who fought for fair housing and helped my family buy a home in a town that would not, that whose real estate agents were intent on not selling to blacks. For people who fought in this city where my parents got their first jobs to get companies to hire African Americans. My parents told me I'm the result, the physical manifestation of a conspiracy of love. That rugged individualism and self-reliance are so important, but you know what? The old African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. Rugged individualism and self-reliance did not get us to the moon. It didn't map the human genome, didn't pave the road. That was done through interdependency, through us looking out for one another, for us understanding that we are stronger together. And that's what we have to get back to. The ideal set forth in the Declaration of Independence, that we pledge to each other our lives, our fortune, and our sacred honor. The work you all are doing is sacred work. It is honorable work. Understanding that this nation, it can't go fast in this economy, we're trying to, but we are on a mission to go far. And the only way to get there is together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Senator Booker, both for being here today and for your dedication to pursuing new ways to improve the EITC and other tax credits for low-wage workers. I'm Lauren Pescatori, and I'm the Director of Tax Credits for Working Families. We are a national communications campaign working to promote these credits at both the state and federal level, and we're thrilled to be here for now the second year in a row partnering with CFED to bring you this event. So you've heard quite a bit today about the big win for the EITC and CTC this past December, and you'll be hearing a lot more from our panelists shortly about what's ahead in the coming years. As Jeremy said, these tax credits aren't always the easiest thing to talk about, right? The federal refundable earned income tax credit doesn't quite roll off the tongue. So a big part of our work at Tax Credits for Working Families, and a lot of you in this room are really engaged in this effort, is to create relatable, digestible materials around these credits in the hopes of really reaching new audiences like policymakers and advocates, but also, and most importantly, potential EITC recipients themselves. But none of this work would be truly sustainable without the help of the media, which is why I'm thrilled to introduce today our next speaker and the moderator of our panel discussion, Dylan Matthews. Dylan was formerly a member of the Washington Post Wonk blog team, and he is now a writer at Vox, which is an online news site that takes complex topics like tax policy and foreign aid and breaks them down in a way that's actually accessible, which is so important in this work. Dylan writes often about tax credits. Most recently, he discussed the EITC as an amazingly simple way to cut poverty, but one that just too few people are aware of. So today, Dylan will lead our panelists in a discussion of the EITC and other vital tax credits and what's ahead in 2016. You'll hear from researchers, advocates, and tax professionals on the importance of these credits and what you can do to help raise awareness of them. So without further ado, I'd like to call up Dylan Matthews to kick off our panel discussion.
Thanks everyone for coming. This is a really incredible turnout for a discussion of tax policy. And we have a really incredible panel for you today. So let me briefly run through who you're going to be hearing from. Catherine Eden has already spoken, but I can't emphasize enough how important her work has been in combining really rigorous quantitative assessments of the impact of these programs with deep ethnographic research that really tells us what it's like for people using them and how crucial they are in low-income communities. You're going to be hearing from Elaine Mogg, who is a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, where she analyzes tax credit policy. She has a very innovative proposal to rework the earned income tax credit into an individual workers credit, which can address many of the issues that we see with childless workers under the EITC today. She also has done some work on making the child tax credit more refundable even after our big win in December. And so I'm excited to hear about that. We have David Newville, who is the Director of Government Affairs at CFED, our host today. David was formerly a senior policy advisor at the Treasury Department, where he worked a lot on consumer finance issues and has some deep knowledge of how these programs can relate to people's finances. David is also going to be speaking about the American Opportunity Tax Credit, which is a sort of important part of the tuition assistance the federal government presents and sometimes gets lost in discussions of these refundable credits. We're going to hear from Lorianne Sales, who's a member of the Montgomery County Community Action Board, a group that works on poverty issues at the local level in Maryland. Lorianne is also going to be talking about EITC from the perspective of someone who used the program and relied on it for savings. I'm really excited that this is going to be one of the few panels I've ever seen or been on where we actually have a consumer perspective for the programs that we're talking about. And last but certainly not least, we have Teresa Patera, who is a senior director for public policy and advocacy at H&R Block, which, as we all know, is one of the leading providers of tax assistance to working families. She was previously a staff member for Chuck Grassley and the Finance Committee and worked on the Affordable Care Act. So she has some deep expertise on the use of tax credits and their use in communities from the perspective of a tax preparer. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the panel. Thanks again, everyone. So just to kick off, we've already talked a lot today about the big win in making the stimulus tax credit expansions permanent this December. But one of the most important parts of that, as we all know, is the lowering of the refundability threshold for the child tax credit, which really turned it from a middle-class credit into something we mentioned in the same breath as the EITC. And so I wanted to open it up to the panel to discuss the importance of that change and how that's going to affect these programs going forward. I don't know, if Elaine, if you wanted to start.
Sure. So this program is critical, and reducing the threshold is extremely important for low-income families. There are 11.5 million children today who have working parents, and they cannot access the full $1,000 child tax credit because their earnings simply aren't high enough, and that's a problem. And that problem would have doubled if the refundability threshold had been allowed to return. So you would have 20 million children sitting in families whose parents are going to work and not receiving the full benefit of the child tax credit. If you want low-income children to receive the benefits, you need to make them available at the low-income end.
Kathy, I know you have a lot of research on what EITC means to families. Does CTC have a sort of similar feeling of being earned?
Yeah, it's interesting. People think of these things just as my tax refund. And I think there's some magic to that. You know, if you ask them, did you file an EIC schedule, they'll look at you like, what's that? You know, and so sometimes as we staked out our spots outside of the local H&R blocks in the sites that we were in, we had to sort of go through people's paperwork and show them where they had filed for the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. So this is part of the magic, right? This is part of why people think the refund is earned, because it comes as a part of, in a vehicle that every other American enjoys when they overpay on their taxes. Some of us end up owing every year. You know, it doesn't quite have the same resonance. But, you know, we often talk about the invisibility of these programs. But in some ways, I think the invisibility adds really to the positive meaning of the credit, at least from the consumer point of view.
Lorianne, do you have a unique perspective on this? Do you agree with Kathy's assessment of the meaning of the credit as something you worked for?
Definitely, there is an aspect of ownership, and I mean, this credit is for working low-income individuals. It's not like the welfare system is, you know, perceived to be. So you feel more confident, and this is a sense of ownership that you take, and you're proud to go in there, and you can't wait to take advantage of that bulk of money to take care of expenses you've accrued. So.
And you've also spoken a lot about the value of the program as a savings tool. So what role did it play? Was it sort of immediately go into a savings account? How did it serve as an incentive to save?
Well, in Montgomery County, we have a program called VITA, the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. And so they educate you on the tax credits you receive and also the savings that you can also take advantage of. So you can purchase a savings bond, or what I did was make sure that I put enough aside to contribute to my daughter's 529 plan, college savings plan. So this is money that I wouldn't ordinarily have access to. It's like my disposable income, and so I was able to set aside money for that and focus on where she could go for summer camp. So definitely expands opportunities for someone with limited resources.
Absolutely. Teresa, we just heard about the importance of VITA, and I know H&R Block is another key player in providing preparation services. What is your experience as a company in working with EITC and CTC clients? It's not where the big bucks is, but what does it mean to you as a company to be part of that process?
So we believe we are the largest filer of EITC returns. We know this taxpayer better than anyone else, right? We were the leader. The company was formed in 1955, so we're going on more than 60 years old. Interestingly, in an era that's similar to where it is now, where people were looking for help with taxes, and Henry and Richard, the H&R Block, decided, or were asked actually, to expand their bookkeeping business to help people who wanted help with their taxes. So with the 60-year history and predominantly with this income group, we see firsthand, and Professor Eden has documented this in her book, we couldn't have said it any better, right? We know whether it's EITC folks or others who are filing early in the season, their money is generally allocated. They're either held back on paying their rent, or they've decided they wanted to splurge and buy their children some Christmas presents. The money is allocated. What we find challenging, and it's become a more increased topic of conversation in the last several years, is how do we guide taxpayers in using this refund? We've followed closely the CFED's rainy day proposals. We've looked at CEP's pilot program from last year on the advanced EITC. I was on the Hill when the last version of the advanced EITC was repealed. We know folks want to save. People know this money's coming. What we see is what we've been asked, especially in the 3.5 years I've been with H&R Block, there's competing interests, right? With ACA having been passed most recently in the push to get people enrolled in healthcare insurance and not having fully subsidized. How do we help them pay for that? How do we help them enroll? How do we help them pay at tax time? How do we help them save for retirement? And how do we help the administration with the MyRA program? And you've heard, we'll hear more about higher education tax credits and 529 plans. So we are happy to be at the table and talk about our expertise, but we're also looking for guidance on how do we help navigate the competing interests and taking into account individualized needs and wants. As Professor Eden's also mentioned in her book, every taxpayer has a vision for how they want to use their money, and yet we're hearing from wonks in DC and others, you should guide them towards this. So we believe we have the expertise and are happy to be part of the conversation, but would love to have the conversation on how do we guide in the right ways on how to use that refund.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that segue on college savings. Since now we turn to David. We basically haven't talked at all about the American Opportunity Credit today, but it's a very significant incentive for attending college. It's a big help in paying for tuition. It reduces debt. Can you talk a bit about where it fits in now that it's been made permanent into the sort of broader universe of federal higher ed policy?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, so the EITC is kind of like the stepchild in this big package deal, right? It's kind of lost in with the EITC and CTC, and obviously, it makes sense why that happens because of the huge impacts of the EITC and the CTC. I mean, EITC is a hugely important credit, but higher ed tax expenditures, as we all know, that they're roughly around $30 to $40 billion annually. They're equal to about what we see with Pell Grants. But if we look at them at the purpose of incentivizing, particularly looking at low and moderate income families, of getting them to get into higher education, motivating higher ed people to take higher education and completion, they're really not, the research shows they're not really effective at doing that. It's not that effective at all. EITC is the biggest of these, around $20 million, and it's the most friendly for lower and moderate income folks because it is partially refundable, but it isn't accomplishing what it really can do in a lot of ways. So I think improvements for the EITC, I think there's one thing in addition, we talked a little bit about the rainy day EITC bill. There's also some other pending legislation to be introduced soon, which I can talk about more later, but that would also kind of address this issue as well to try to improve the EITC for low and moderate income folks. But right now it is the largest program and the most favorable for low income folks.
Absolutely. So yeah, it makes sense to talk a bit about the gaps that we still have. Kathy, in addition to your book on EITC, you co-authored $2 a Day. A big theme of which was how the end of AFDC, for all its flaws, removed a source of cash assistance for really desperately poor people who still generally aren't accessing credits with work requirements. What can the tax credit system do, if anything, to try to address that gap and reach that population?
So first of all, I have to thank you. Of all of the pieces that have been written about $2 a day, I would commend Dylan's piece to you. It's just excellent. But there is this gap, and the way the EITC is structured is that the more you work, the more you get from the program, up to sort of the phase-out point. And families know this, and so they want to work more. And you know, talk to a part-time worker. They want to be a full-time worker. I think the work that we have ahead of us is to try to figure out how to expand work opportunity for a broader segment of Americans. I think we're in an age, and this is only going to get worse over time, when if you don't have a college degree, there's often just not enough work to go around. And the less skilled you are, the more this is true. We watched Jennifer Hernandez and Madonna Harris in Chicago, two of the characters in $2 a day, struggle for months applying for dozens and dozens of jobs, either in person or on their, in Susan Brown's case in Chicago, on a tiny touchscreen iPhone, only to be met with rejection after rejection after rejection. Then in Johnson City, Tennessee, when Travis and Jessica Compton finally find work, he at Burger King and her at a Red Lobster, they enjoyed 4 months of stability. They were finally able to get out of the Goodwill homeless shelter and get into an apartment, kind of a modest little apartment there in Johnson City on the top of a hill. They were able to, just a one bedroom, but you know, Blythe and Rachel had that bedroom as a place to play. But then, of course, when the foot traffic slowed right after Thanksgiving, their hours were reduced to zero, leading them into a spell of $2 a day poverty. Now, what was interesting about their stories, they were able to hold their landlord at bay. They were 3 months behind at the rent by the time February came by saying, "We'll give you our tax credit when it comes." So, I mean, this is really, as Senator Booker said, you know, life and death for many of these families. So we do need to expand work opportunity, ensure that if you want a full-time, full-year job, you can get one.
Absolutely. That last point brings up another kind of change that's often been discussed by policymakers, especially sort of right-of-center legislators who've often proposed turning EITC into something more like a traditional wage subsidy. You get it with your paycheck instead of claiming it. And that would really radically change the program in a lot of ways. I don't know if Teresa has some experience with the advanced EITC program, which was trying to do something like that, or if you can speak to sort of what a change like that could mean.
I believe it was 2011 when the advanced EITC in its current form was repealed, but the take rate was pretty low. It was 1% to 2%. There was conversations around abuse, but it's been a while since I went back and looked at exactly what the reasons were.
Sure.
I think the important takeaway, whether it's the advanced EITC or we're talking about refunds, is that the need for cash and quick cash for this income group has not gone away. And so that's the conversation, right? And I think it's important as we're thinking about, okay, there's a segment of folks that would like to have their money throughout the year, and that was proven out in CEP's pilot study last year. On the flip side, I think we need to address what Professor Eden's written about in her book, which is there is a psychology behind getting your refund in a lump sum because you can plan for that, even though you might not know the exact amount. There are aspirational goals that come with getting one large chunk. You can buy the refrigerator, the used car, pay off the holiday bill. So I think it's, we're interested in this as a company, interested in understanding what consumers want and how to make that happen, particularly as the demand seems to be there, whether it's throughout the year or as quick as possible at the beginning of the tax filing season.
Absolutely. Elaine, you've speaking to the points that Kathy was raising about sort of reaching more vulnerable populations, you've done some work on the idea of expanding refundability for the child credit even further. Could you talk a bit about that and sort of what that would look like and the kind of effects it would have?
Right, so I do want to echo Kathy's point that the tax system is really only equipped to deliver benefits to people who make money. So there is a chunk of people who we can't really expect the tax system to touch. So we shouldn't forget about them in these conversations about trying to find assistance. The child tax credit, though, and the EITC, there's ways we could spend not that much money and really have an impact on an important group of people. So it was a huge victory to reduce the threshold to $3,000, but it's still confusing and complex. Like, why do I have to earn $3,000 to start getting my child tax credit? It's simpler to phase it in exactly like we do the earned income tax credit. With the first dollar of earnings, you receive 15 cents until you get your maximum credit of $1,000 per child. A reform like this isn't that expensive because most people are already getting the full CTC, so it's only the people who, those 11 million children who aren't getting the full CTC that would get closer to that full amount if we dropped the refundability threshold all around. In tax policy, we always think about, we want to make programs simple so people can understand them and react to them. We also want to make them simple so the IRS can administer them. Do you want to, the earned income tax credit reform, if we were going to do that?
Oh, yeah. No, I'd love to hear about that.
The piece that's the big low-lying fruit that's out there right now is exactly what Ellen was talking about earlier and Senator Booker, that there is a group of people who are still taxed into poverty. These are workers who do not have children living with them at home. They're the only group that claims this distinction. And it is mind-boggling to me that for at least 3 years in a row, President Obama has put this proposal into the State of the Union. There are Republicans that say they absolutely want almost an identical program, double the credit, make it more broadly available, and we still don't have it. So I think that's sort of a first step where people ought to be looking to expand the credit. I wrote a paper that goes one step further. That is certainly not an original idea on my part. It is, you can think of it as a long parade of people who have said we ought to be separating child and work incentives in the tax code. So if we broke off a piece of the earned income tax credit and the proposal I analyzed said, let's make a $1,500 credit. This will be contingent only on work. It'll phase in exactly like the one-child EITC does and phase out on the same schedule, so people will be looking at the same sorts of tables. It'll fully offset your payroll taxes. I think the credit's probably big enough that it could encourage people to enter the labor market if jobs are available. The problem is when you break off work and child incentives, the good thing is it's easy for the IRS to administer the work piece because we don't have these complicated residency requirements that are associated with the child EITC. The problem is it's extraordinarily expensive because there are a lot of people who are low-income workers who are not receiving benefits today. So those competing interests will have to be sorted out.
Absolutely. You were talking about lowering the earnings threshold for CTC. Is there a viable option of just making it a fully refundable credit? That loses some of the work incentive, but it does there are many countries that have a child allowance system like that.
Right. So I would be concerned a little bit with the asking the IRS to administer a fully refundable, as in every child in the United States gets $1,000. I'm not sure they're the right agency. It would pull a lot of people into the tax system, and the IRS would absolutely need, support to administer this kind of program. Close to that would be a credit that just started phasing in. And these folks are already in the tax system. Yeah. They're already filing returns to get withheld money back or to get their earned income tax credit. So that's not such a leap.
Got it. I wanted to move back to you, Lorianne, for some of this conversation about the logistics about how you get it. Were you glad to get it in a lump sum? Were there times it would have been more convenient if you could have sort of gotten it as a periodic installment?
I think the benefit is in the lump sum. I think Teresa alluded to, you accrue financial expenses over the course of Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. And so having that lump sum and being able to prioritize what needs to be taken care of instead of, worrying about it throughout the year and trying to save here, save there, I think it's more advantageous to keep it at the bulk return where it's at now. So I think you have more flexibility with how you spend it and more ownership of how it's being spent. So,
and you've also talked to a lot of people benefiting from this as part of your work with VITA. You're a VITA advocate.
Yes.
And do they share this sentiment? What do you hear from them about what the program means?
This program, the lines that we get when people are signing up to have their taxes prepared and the stories that they hear sitting across from these people who are expecting this refund and what they can do with this money, it's very compelling stories. I can't imagine them getting the same benefit with a little bit extra every week. It's really hard when you're already struggling and to think that you can set aside this money every week instead of I get a couple of $1,000s and I can take care of this bill and I can take care of this savings account, and it just gives you a lot more flexibility. So definitely hear benefits.
David, we've been neglecting you once again, but I'm interested in some of the ideas you had for improving AOTC to draw more people in, since this is a problem that we have this extensive support network, and still we have a lot of people not going, and we have many more people not finishing. So what are some ways we can address that?
Yeah, so I think when you look at the AOTC and you look at higher education tax credits in general, I think one of the biggest problems is just awareness of them. A lot of people, there's been research that's shown that even people who qualify for these don't realize they're even getting them, and the incentives around them, even beyond just being aware of what's out there. And part of it is they're incredibly complex, right? There's AOTC is the biggest, but there's lifetime learning. There's the higher ed deductions. There's a variety of other smaller ones, student loan interest deduction. There's like a lot going on in the space, and there's some of them are conflicting. Some are for grad school. Some cover certain expenses. Et cetera, et cetera. It's very complicated. So figuring that out. So I think figuring out a way to raise awareness is a huge part of it. I think the other huge factor when it comes, particularly to the low and moderate income folks, is the fact that all these credits, for the most part, you have to put the expenses out there first, you have to spend them, and then you get reimbursed for them through the tax system. So if you don't have that, if you're low income, you don't have that money to spend in the first place, it makes it very difficult to be able to take advantage of that. So one thing that CFED has been working on with Representative Ben Ray Lujan's office on the Save for Success Act would be introduced, is some legislation that will be introduced soon that would address some of these issues and also have another bonus. Part of it would have provisions that would deal with the outreach to help people become more aware of the OTC. It would also deal with this earlier aspect by allowing people to advance college savings into 529s in a small amount annually, to be able to have that count as like an advanced AOTC into 529s. And what we know about 529s, for people who aren't familiar with them too, they're obviously a college savings vehicle that administered at the state level, is that they are also an important tool for college savings, but they disproportionately benefit the wealthy, right? Low-income folks are not really be able to use them or take advantage of them. So this would kind of pair those up in some ways. And the third kind of key bonus thing, which is a big part of what CFED has done and focused on in our work in general, is about, for children, when you do college savings, not only just the amount, even if it's a small amount, how that changes the aspirations of children and of their parents as well. So it gets them to start thinking about higher ed. It becomes a possibility that they start planning for it. It changes people's approaches to it. So this piece of legislation, which is coming out soon, like I said, and Graham Mason from Congressman Lujan's office is here in the front. If folks are interested in learning more about it, if you're an organization that wants to endorse, or if you're interested in kind of signing on to the bill. Also, there's not a Senate bill, I should mention, too, at least not yet, so if there's interest there as well. But this is a piece of legislation, I think, that would really advance on those three fronts and a couple other ways as well to kind of improve these credits even further for low-income families.
Right. It was really interesting the point you made about it changing children's expectations, and as Ellen was saying earlier, there's been a lot of research lately about what these credits mean to children and sort of the concrete effects that they can have in families. Kathy, I don't know if you can speak to what we've learned about that in recent years.
Yeah, I think as Ellen was saying, it's really sort of astonishing the broad array of impacts that the EITC is having on families. And again, you know, when families get the EITC, and this really echoes what you've been saying, they're tired of struggling, right? And it's like getting to February and getting that credit is like crossing a finish line. You know, you make it sort of dragging yourself across that finish line, because at that point you've been living for about 6 months in the red, according to our data. So, you know, there is this tremendous sense of need that, you know, we've got to pay attention to, and we've got to tweak the EITC in ways to make more savings possible. You know, and this is what our rainy day proposal is all about. But the idea that you can lift your head up out of the tunnel. You know, I'm a Minnesotan, and our what state mascot is the gopher. You know, it's like you're a gopher, and suddenly, I don't know if you've ever seen a gopher hole, but the gopher every once in a while puts her head up and looks this way and looks that way and then darts back down. Research by behavioral economists and psychologists have shown that the ability to get out of the tunnel mentally, that the relief of scarcity, and we know that people are living, you know, in the black for 3 to 6 months after the receipt of the EITC, actually changes their mental processes, and it changes their ability to look toward the long term and to actually plan. So you see all this forward thinking, and suddenly people are not thinking about getting by. They're thinking about getting ahead. And I think this is part of the reason why you see these long-term sort of upward trajectories coming out of the EITC. You know, we're actually seeing that the EITC is a vehicle for mobility, not just security. That's why I'm such a big fan of the lump sum, but I'm also a fan of expanding the savings so we could sort of mitigate a little bit against those 6 months when you are living in the red. I also like everything Elizabeth said.
Elaine, just to return to some of these points in your proposal, there's some other sort
Elaine. Sorry. Okay. I should have done that.
We all had to check. There are a lot of other sort of small things besides the childless worker gap, besides the issues with refundability and the child tax credit. The child tax credit sum isn't adjusted for inflation, for example. What do the prospects look like as someone who sort of has her ear to the ground about this for those kinds of fixes?
So I don't know what the prospects are, but I can say I looked at a lot of different ways you can tweak the child tax credit, because I think there's a lot of chatter about doing this, and there's a lot of different angles you can take. And how you do it really matters. It depends who you want to affect. If you hear a proposal to double the child tax credit, that tax credit will go to the same people who receive it today. People at the low income end will not receive the full benefit. There's not enough earnings. People in middle income groups will receive that benefit, and people in the very highest income group won't benefit because they don't really receive the child tax credit. It phases out. If you want to put more hands in, more money in the pockets of people who might really need it, there's a pretty interesting proposal that CAP floated not that long ago, which is to create a young child tax credit. So we know that getting money to parents when their children are very young is critical to putting them on a lifetime trajectory of good things. There are very specific needs for very young children. Childcare needs are usually much more intense. You usually can't go even to any childcare program that's sponsored by states until you're about 3 years old. Diapers and time off work for these families. So they proposed the idea of adding a $1,500 child tax credit that would only go to families with children 3 or under 3. And I think this is a pretty interesting way to expand the child tax credit. It would work the same as the child tax credit. In their proposal, it would be fully refundable, and I would have my same doubts about the IRS delivering a fully refundable child tax credit to young children as I do about children there. But we looked at giving it to people who are already in the tax system, so the same kind of credit. So you could tinker the benefit amounts for particular populations and deliver, I think we said an average of $150 to all these low-income parents of young children.
Did you look at all at the prospect? I understand your skepticism about full refundability, but the phase-in is pretty slow. Am I right in thinking it's 15%?
Yeah.
Would it make a big difference to up that to 25, 30?
Absolutely. That would be the reform that could target dollars immediately to those most in need, because it won't cost that much, because most people are already getting the full $1,000 per child. So how fast you phase it in doesn't affect them at all. It affects very low-income families how fast you phase it in, because they're the families not accessing the full value of the credit today. So if you doubled the phase-in rate to 30%, you'd be, it'd take half as long to get there. You'd only need $4,000 of earnings above whatever the floor is to get your full $1,000. So that could be a really important and not very costly reform.
Absolutely. So in one way we can get more money in the hands of these families without Congress even doing anything, which seems like a reasonable assumption for the next year. No offense. Is just to spread awareness of the program and do more outreach. Teresa, as someone who provides these services and I know has worked on providing, there's a free filer program I know you work on with some other preparers. What do you see as the most promising ways to expand the pool and reduce the share of eligible recipients who aren't getting it?
So a couple of things. I'm sure Lorianne probably will have some insights as well from a VITA perspective. So the awareness issue, so I think it's close to 20% of eligible EITC filers are not claiming it. When you try to dig in and unpack that, and there's a researcher currently out of the University of Texas, Austin, who's working with the IRS on this as well, to try to understand. One of the challenges with the EITC is it hinges off of work, and I think it's I can't remember which way this goes, but the population of EITC filers every year is not the same. The mobility in and out of the credit is pretty significant. I'll also take this opportunity to talk about that and talking about reforms. We put together a paper, not necessarily, this isn't me, this is my colleagues in Kansas City who are planning this, irrespective of knowing that I was participating in this panel, that talks about the complication around eligibility, not just for the EITC, but across the different credits. And part of my background not only was on the Hill for a few years, but I actually started out as a CPA and worked at the IRS. And I have to tell you, it took me a good 8 hours to read this, to understand. And this isn't plain English, this isn't legalese. You should have a copy on your chairs. If it's not, you can get it at our website at thetaxinstitute.com. But there are questions that have to be answered for all of these credits that are as simple as, whose child is this that belongs in a house? My colleagues did a pretty good job of trying to, tongue-in-cheek, highlight the issues. You can have unrelated relatives, if you can imagine that. That's the way the tax code is written, that can be eligible for these credits.
Like who?
So there's a definite, without going down in the rabbit hole, because it's complicated, you could have a qualifying relative that's not a qualifying child, and the qualifying relative doesn't have to be related to you by the normal definition of what I think a relation is. You can have a non-dependent dependent. There is, a concept in here that they've called all or nothing, which if you decide in your conversations in your non-traditional household, for example, which somebody raised this before, the concept of a childless worker is not truly childless, right? They're non-custodial parents. If you look at today's living arrangements, you could have your fiance living with you, her child, or your child, or you're taking care of your niece or nephew. The current iteration of the uniform definition of child, which is now 10 years old, which is our impetus for putting this paper together, did a great job of simplifying the definition of a child. but 10 years later, it's time to take a look at that across these, not just the 5 credits that UDC was intended to address, but look at the ACA, which introduced a concept of a tax family, goes beyond the tax return to determine who's in your household, or the AOTC. So none of these things were addressed. And one of the last key concepts is that if you, in your conversations with who lives in your household, determine, okay, it makes more sense for you to claim the EITC, that means you might be the child or the qualifying non-dependent dependent or the qualifying relative that's not related to you, therefore makes you ineligible for some of the other 4 or 5 tax credits. So there's a lot of confusion and complexity that it's difficult for us to explain to a client.
The error rate.
Thank you. I was bridging towards that. Whether you're in front of us in our office or in our software online, it's difficult to explain these concepts. And Professor Eden, you mentioned in your book, which we've had some discussions about, that how do you educate a taxpayer? Do they understand what they're getting? Is it EITC, CTC? Some people want to know, others don't want to know. They just want the money. But if we're trying to be good corporate citizens and we're trying to educate, in addition to educating across how to use your refund, we find it difficult to figure out how to explain CTC versus EITC versus dependent exemption and head of household. Layer on top of that, I heard you, Elaine, talk about phase-ins, which is extremely complicated, right? So if you, how do you, so in one level, you have to get into people's individual living arrangements, which imagine whether you're in a VITA site or in our office, having to be, and I haven't prepared taxes in 20 years, but if you came into me and I had to start asking you, okay, how is this child related to you? Why is the parent who's not living with you claiming this child? It's not what was really intended by the tax code. So we don't have solutions for this, but as you think about next steps on the EITC or dependent-related benefits, in addition to thinking about phase-ins and non-custodial parents, we'd love to see this conversation be exposed as well, because we think it's critical. Some of it impacts the dignity of a client, whether in our office or in our VITA site. And it all impacts back to what you talked about, awareness, right? It's difficult to create an awareness campaign, which right now has to be, you may qualify for the EITC, which the IRS has sent out postcards, and I had to talk to one of our tax professionals in a suburb of Chicago who was furious. She said, IRS sent out this note, and we've had this counseling session with our client, and now they think we're not giving them something that they deserve. There's no good way to identify who's eligible because of the complexity. So sorry for the long answer, but Lorianne may have some
we're redefining childhood. Kathy, I know, had some comments to add here.
So in other work I've done with Maria Cafals, Timothy Nelson, and Laura Tack, we've documented that instability and complexity in American families has grown exponentially in recent years. As many as the bottom 40% of households are affected by this, so upper income households have gotten more and more stable. The opposite has happened in the bottom 40%. We now we are more unstable and complex in our family structure than we've ever been before in our history, and we are unique among rich nations in the level of instability and complexity that we see. One of our close competitors is Latvia, and I don't think we want to be in the same league with Latvia. So this is exactly what we saw on the ground with the hundreds of families that we followed from tax time through 6-month anniversary of their receipt. It's not that they intended to defraud the government. Indeed, they can't understand the tax code well enough to do that. They're really in sort of this vacuum that this complexity of the tax code has created. Folk theories prevail, and sometimes folks who are trying to be honest and play by the rules simply don't realize that they're violating the rules. So I would emphasize that we need to really put attention toward clarifying some of these things so that people don't end up in a situation where they're acting in ways that they themselves would feel was immoral if they knew the implications of what they were doing.
Oh, yeah.
So I wanted to return to your original point, too. I know that days like today, we talk about how many people aren't receiving the EITC, but the other side of the story is that the EITC is a huge success. The participation rate for people in the EITC relative to other transfer programs is much higher. It's the gold standard for getting people to come in. So as tragic as it is that there are people eligible for the credit that are not getting it, many people who are eligible for the credit are getting it.
Absolutely.
And
David?
one other thing I would just add really quick about the complexity issue, which hasn't come up yet, is the preparer side of it as well, right? Because I think a lot of these errors, particularly around the EITC, I mean, there's complexity, there's complex tax code, there's complex family arrangements, and then you have the preparer side where errors can happen. Speaking of, whether Congress is going to get anything done, one issue that is currently pending is paid tax preparer regulation, right?
Yeah.
Which would be very nice to see happen in this Congress. And, the IRS did work in this area, did some good work in doing, setting up competency exams and doing registrations. Unfortunately, back in 2010, it was struck down by the courts under statutory authority. So this is where Congress would come in to give that authority back. But making sure that preparers have some kind of basic competency and they're preparing things properly is extremely important. I think in certain states, I saw recently, like Ohio, you have to undergo more regulations and more exams to cut someone's hair than to prepare their taxes, which is crazy when you think about it. Something as important as taxes and making sure these things are right. So I think that's a huge step forward that needs to happen. And I know like a lot of the major professional chains provide training and support this idea around paid preparer regulation, and the VITA program as well, the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Programs for people that don't know it. The accuracy rate around VITA, even though it's a small program, is around 94% right now, which is huge in doing these things. So I think there's some good, and VITA volunteers undergo really rigorous training as well to do this. So,
David, that was, we don't even have to go to the haircutters in Ohio, right?
Exactly, yeah, VITA.
We struggle with, we've been supportive of this, right? We have a pretty rigorous program. You've got to do 80 hours of training before you can even take our test to be a first-year preparer. And every year you get 35 hours of tax education and then additional ethics and systems training. VITA is probably just as rigorous as our program, if not more, because there's pretty rigorous testing every year. And for volunteers to go through that and other paid preparers not, especially to tie this back to EITC, right? About 60% of people choose to get help with their tax returns. And the majority of those who are going to a paid preparer are going to someone that doesn't have a credential, right? So you can cut down the error rate as well. So if you look at the IRS's studies on error rates on EITC by the type of paid preparer, even paid preparer rates are high. Self-prepared rates are also high, which is interesting given the rise of software. So there's got to be, as we're talking about paid preparer oversight, looking at how do you put better bells and whistles in a software, but both of those get complicated by having to put these crazy intrusive questions about your family style in these realms. But sorry, yes, on the paid preparer side, we're hoping that we can get some consensus around that there should be some oversight, some minimum competency standards, and even if it's saying let's elevate people to the VITA standards, that's one good step, right?
We're almost out of time, but before we end, Lorianne, I'd love to hear your perspective as a VITA volunteer, sort of what that's like training-wise, like what your experience with the program.
On both sides, being an advocate and a consumer, I think it's really important with ensuring that there is visibility of where the locations are, making sure that they are metro accessible. And in Montgomery County, one of our most diverse counties in the state of Maryland, you have to look at language, the bilingual and what languages are people familiar with. It's confusing just for the layperson. Can you imagine translating this in a different language and letting people know what's available to them? So I think there are a lot of different avenues that we have to explore. We're also working with the United Way on an ad campaign for the bus, but we work with the colleges and the community colleges to recruit student volunteers to come in for very intense training and a lot of volunteer hours. They're actually working one-on-one with the consumers as well. So, and they get feedback. We also do exit interviews. So it's a very intense process. Yes, exactly, very intense process.
Excellent. So I think with that, this has been great. We'll open it up to questions if there's anybody.
Hi, I'm Megan Trace with United Way Worldwide. Clearly it's an election year and the presidential is really dominating the national dialogue. And there's rumblings about tax reform in 2017 and comprehensive approaches. Who knows? But presidential candidates have been dropping their tax plans, and so I'm curious if the panel might be able to comment on elements that may be promising or concerning with the presidential candidates' tax reform plans as it relate to the credits.
I think Elaine of us probably knows the most.
Just the Tax Policy Center is sort of going through candidate by candidate what we can to analyze proposals. The Bush analysis and Trump analysis has been released. Rubio and Cruz are hot on their heels, as are Sanders and Clinton. But I think the thing that we're seeing is these packages are not realistic. They are enormous tax cuts for everyone. And so it's not clear to me how you think about them. Do you think like this is really the whole package they want? Or instead, do you think that for any given group, what's proposed is the top? And so I think maybe you get concerned about that. Candidate Rubio has a pretty sweeping proposal to add a $2,500 child tax credit. This sounds really lovely. As detailed, though, it will really only go to middle and higher income families, and that's because it's refundable sort of to the extent that you have payroll and income tax liability, and for families with children, the earned income tax credit is already wiping out that liability, so the additional credit will go to upper and middle income families. He also has a personal credit. There's a lot of discussion surrounding the personal credit, what it means in the actual text of the proposal. It says it's a $2,000 or $4,000 credit designed to offset the personal exemption for filers, the standard deduction, and the 10% bracket that he gets rid of. In this case, that will not benefit very low-income families because it's not refundable. However, the document leading up to the thing says it's a fully refundable credit. And then there's been some discussion at Vox. They told you all that it was fully refundable but not available to anyone who wasn't already working. So we don't really know is the bottom line. And we really hope we get clarification on that, and we do ask the candidates. Trump's proposal didn't have a lot to speak to for low-income families. There's certainly these expansions to childless EITC that still come up, but I haven't seen anything now that's really realistic given the huge budget hole that any of these plans would blow.
Yeah, I don't know that the first time they decided to add a work credit to that plan was in an email to me. I wouldn't be surprised. It turns out when you ask Republicans, do you really want to give $4,000 to every household, no strings attached, they say no.
Right, because this is like a lot of elderly folks who aren't working. This is low-income families who are not low-income, they're just no-income kind of families. So there's a lot of questions. And I think a lot of times the tax code is extremely complicated, and a candidate just isn't going to be able to develop a plan that would mimic the federal tax code, but how they want it. It's, they're trying to develop policies on multiple fronts.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David, I know you.
Yeah, I would just say, this is one area that CFED is very interested in around this idea of leveraging the elections and kind of looking at the momentum for potential tax reform that would happen, in a new Congress and a new administration in 2017. Part of it is based basically off some work that we've done looking at wealth inequality and kind of the role that the tax code does in driving wealth inequality to the order of $600 or $700 billion annually around incentives for retirement, home ownership, a variety of other areas. And we launched a campaign being led by my colleague over there, Ezra Levin, the Turn It Right Side Up campaign, which is kind of focused on this. The Rainy Day EITC proposal is actually a really small part of that, and there's a larger momentum behind that. But the essential idea is that, as we all know, when it comes to inspiring opportunity in these areas, a lot of these programs more than disproportionately benefit those who are higher income earners and really don't provide the incentives to people who need the most that are lower down the ladder. So we're doing a lot of work in this area. We've engaged, I think it's been pointed out already, the Republican side, there's not a lot there right now. And correct me if I'm wrong, there's been little proposals released on the Democratic side, but nothing comprehensive yet that we've seen. But we've engaged with the Clinton campaign on a particular tax credit, the proposal that they put out that looks somewhat promising, and I'm sure there'll be more of that going forward. But yeah, it's a little bit early, but it's something that we'll be pushing forward through the election season into the next Congress.
Yeah, before we go to the next question, I was wondering, we haven't had as much conversation on the Democratic side for taxes, but we've had a lot for college. Bernie Sanders has a free tuition plan for all public universities. Hillary Clinton has a universal IBR plan. For that matter, Jeb Bush has a universal income-based repayment plan. Where do you see AOTC fitting in if sort of ambitious reforms like those are attempted?
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, this idea, the idea of the Save for Success Act, I think this idea of advancing the AOTC and using the 529 vehicle is very interesting for the variety of reasons that I'd already laid out. And, the bills itself, I think it has a huge impact for the reasons I laid out about changing aspirations and delivering it earlier. But you could see it actually doesn't change the credit overall, right? It still has a $10,000 cap. So you could see an expansion of that in some other ways and a variety of other things that could be added onto it. I think that piece of legislation itself is hugely impactful. I think one really other interesting thing, I would say on the Republican side, one interesting thing is, CFED's done a lot of work on children's savings accounts, looking at 529's longer-term savings vehicle. The Bush campaign released a policy proposal which is still lacking a lot of details around education savings accounts, which essentially would be something similar in that fashion, that you could see something big coming out, something positive on the Republican side, like an interesting idea there that could be wrapped up into something bigger. Obviously the devil's in the details, but it could be an interesting proposal.
Yeah, it's encouraging. Any other questions?
Oh, good morning. My name is Robin Nato. I'm with Goodwill Industries International, and I just have a short comment and a question. So with Goodwill Industries International, we also are ecstatic about the December victory, and we too believe that the next step is raising the value of the EITC for childless workers. My question is more general, and it's to anyone on the panel. We know that poverty reduction is on the leadership agenda for this Congress, yet, and it goes back to the first question, there's a very short window before we focus more and more and more on the election, and to really focus on getting things passed before that shift to the election happens. So my question is this for all of you. What advice can you give to advocates like ourselves really around action? What can we be doing to help ensure that this remains a priority during that window?
Anyone move to speak?
So one of my bosses once told me you should never predict something will happen and when it will happen. You can only do one of the two. So I don't know if it's realistic that anything's going to happen in this Congress. That doesn't mean we give up. It means I think that you continue to add to the marketplace of ideas. You put good ideas forward, because eventually windows and opportunities open, and you want staffers to be able to go to the shelf and pull off high-quality policies that people are ready to implement. It seems like because there's so much talk around this childless EITC, it's been going on for so many years, it seems like a logical place to put your heart and soul, today. And don't think it's not going to benefit children too. As other people have spoken out, some of these people some of the folks that would benefit absolutely have children. They're just not living with them more than half the year as the tax code would require.
I would say, as a former staffer, you hit the nail on the head, right? Just because Congress may not act doesn't mean the staff, as Senator Booker so aptly conveyed, staff are still working, and if you've got a Senator Booker and a Senator Moran who are still interested in developing things for when it moves, you don't pull back from your work, right? You continue to work it so that there's something to pull off the shelf.
Yeah. I just would say real quick too, looking at what we started out celebrating here today, if you told, definitely outside the Beltway, if people are like, oh, Congress isn't doing anything, nothing's get done, and here we ended up with the biggest impact in 20 years, on poverty. That is obviously no small thing, and I mean, beyond that, there's a lot of smaller things like, I think, tax preparer regulation, rainy day EITC, a variety of legislation we talked about today that still has viable chances of moving the next year. But regardless, I think work is getting done on these things, even if it doesn't pass legislation. So I think it's important to keep that momentum going.
Fantastic.
Hi, sorry. Andrew Grossman, Joint Committee on Taxation. There is a small provision in the PATH Act that I haven't read a lot of media accounts of, but I think it's a fairly significant change for this population. So I was trying to figure out if maybe people didn't know about it or it wasn't as big a change as I thought. Which is to say, in Section 201 of PATH, there was a rule that said W-2s need to be filed to the IRS by January 31, which speeds up the process. But then there was a rule added in PATH that said the IRS cannot issue a refund to anyone claiming the EIC or the child tax credit before February 15th. I haven't seen any media reports about this, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the effect of that delay on the population here and about education around that change.
Teresa, can you speak?
So we definitely caught it and definitely paid attention to it. So the statute aside, right, IRS's guidance for the last several years has been within 21 days. And that 21 days, the ticking of that clock has depended upon when IRS would open for e-file. So until IRS opened, it was difficult, right? So last year or 2 years ago, IRS wasn't opening until January 31st or February 1, and so February 15th would have been sooner than February 21st, right? So also compounding whether EIC or not is IRS's attempts at curbing identity theft fraud, and refunds have been slowing down as a result of that anyway. So so e-file just opened January 19th. So 21 days from there puts us around February 15th, but then you had Jonas come in, and we know that weather has an impact on when people file and how they file. So I think we're still waiting to see what the inquiries will be. Taxpayers expect, or our clients expect their refund within 21 days, and if that doesn't happen and it's effective next year. It's effective next year, okay.
So it's not an issue.
So we have some time to educate, yeah.
Kathy, did you have anything on that, or you good?
Wow. So I think I'll pass on that issue, but I will say it does seem that when the longer it takes, the more you sort of open up a window for folks to rush those refunds in ways that remove the part of the bottom line.
Absolutely.
To make that connection more clearly, right? I mean, some of the conversations we've been having is we have seen a reintroduction of short-term lending products, which they're no longer the full refund because that's not full at risk. But if it's $500 or $1,000, will the push to February 15th speed that increase? We don't know, but we're interested in having those policy conversations too to see what others are hearing and seeing.
And CFPB hasn't been cracking down on that.
I'm sorry?
CFPB.
No, because they're not. What you're seeing is no interest.
Right.
So far, no interest, right, or low interest, and whatever that.
Yeah.
So.
Got it.
This is Lee Davenport, and this came up for us. This was my question also. This came up for us in my last Electronic Tax Administration's Advisory Council meeting, and it was Deb, Commissioner of Wage and Investment, who mentioned they were going to start to put this in for next February 15th. They didn't really have an idea of how it would impact the system, how the lending products would respond. I think there is going to be a really big problem that comes around those kind of 60-day loans that pop up because it's a fixed amount. No one can promise a refund faster than February 15th. So I think our recommendations for policy-wise is going to be that it's both refundable and non-refundable credits that they have this new kind of plan in action, because they don't have a plan anyway. They just knew they're going to start it next year. And so to have some equity in the system, that's the one that was my exact question. So thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathy Brannigan from National Disability Institute. I want to thank the panel for all the great conversation today. I don't really have a question, but I just really want to reiterate the importance of education on this. I have some quick stats about people with disabilities, but I think it's really eye-opening. 1 in 5 Americans identify as a person with a disability, and 1 in 3 live in poverty, which is why the EITC and free tax preparation, like My Free Taxes, is so important to this community. Here's some statistics from the IRS. In 2015, over 448 tax returns were prepared for people with disabilities, a 3% increase from the previous year. Of those returns, 143,000 claimed the EITC, resulting in $68.1 million, which it sounds like a great number, and it is, but there is so much more work that needs to be done in education in our communities for the people who really need it to get this refund. So that's it. Thank you.
No, it's an important point, and especially given how difficult it can be to work on Social Security disability, sort of having some work-based programs for people with disabilities who are trying to enter the workforce is hugely important. I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, Kathy, or I feel like I'm just throwing questions at you.
Well, you know, we've said publicly that one thing that we really learned through $2 a day is probably several of the 8 families whose lives we chronicle could, if they tried hard enough and long enough, have gotten onto SSI, and they're very resistant to doing that because they don't want to like lose this identity of worker. And you know, I thinking of Martha Johnson and Ray McCormick most centrally, both of whom have small suitcases of medications because they have so many diagnoses for which they're on daily medication. There are a number of people that are sort of in this category of, you know, not quite sick enough to sort of give up on that identity of worker, but really have a hard time physically fulfilling the obligations of many jobs. And what we've advocated for is some new thinking on disability. Why should you have to choose between being disabled and working? After all, Martha Johnson could man that local library in that little town of Percy, Mississippi that's rarely open because the town doesn't have enough money to pay a librarian. There's so much good work that the disabled could do, and yet we've got this sort of choice that folks have to make. You can work a little bit on SSI, of course, but really, you know, once you're on SSI, you're likely to stay in that category for the rest of your lifetime. So we really advocate that even among the disabled, this piece of inclusion and citizenship and dignity is vital, and we should be giving more of those folks an opportunity to contribute. And if the EITC can then further bolster their sense of citizenship and participation, that's a win-win.
I think we have time for one very, 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 very quick question, if anyone's out there. Yes.
Thanks. David Mitchell, Aspen Institute. I just was wondering if the panel could talk about a credit that is not normally involved in this discussion, the Savers Credit, if there's a potential role in the future for you know, a refundable Savers Credit that also helps working people get ahead.
Elaine, do you have
Okay, so this is talking out of turn because this isn't one of my issues, but I think the issue is that we know low-income families need to save. We need to be able to get through these rainy days and through short-term problems. The problem is when you are low-income and you are struggling, a savings account is a luxury, right? You can keep it maybe for those 6 months. That's right. But after that, it's like you need the money. So I don't know really how far a savings match program can really help people who are very low-income families. I think there's a tier of families who are struggling but more stable that a Savers Credit could do a lot of work for. But very low-income households, I have a hard time imagining how much impact it would have or why it would have more impact than any kind of matching fund or discretionary income added to a household.
David?
Yeah,
I would just say I hear definitely those points. I mean, we definitely know the unstable lives of low-income families and how they need to pull on. Saving for longer-term purposes like retirement can be difficult when you need to tap those funds. I mean, one thing that speaks to that, I think, is the administration's MyRA proposal, right? So a lot of people don't know this. MyRA, of course, is like a retirement account vehicle that it's meant for, but it is technically built off a Roth structure. So it can be used, even though the administration, the Treasury Department certainly won't advertise it this way, as an emergency savings vehicle, right? So if you put money in there, you could save it. And if you don't need to tap it, it could be for long-term purposes. But you could remove it for penalty-free, if you run into these cases where you do have liquidity issues, right, which frequently come up. So it's a nice kind of middle ground. It's safe, because we know lower-income folks tend to be more risk-averse. You don't want to lose that money, right? It doesn't have a huge return on it, but it's based in treasuries, so it's a pretty stable base there, so it's a great proposition for doing that. I mean, the other thing I would say too, and this to bring this back to H&R Block again, this was a while ago that research that H&R Block did, I believe back in 2005, I think, around specifically this issue: will low-income people save for retirement? And the research is some of the most promising research out there, that when you do use incentives and you do matches, low-income folks will save actually for longer-term purposes. And this was, of course, pre-MyRA and being able to use these other things. So I think, we talked before, like, what would you like to see in comprehensive tax reform? That could be a panel that could go on all day, right, when it comes to this area. But like a refundable savers credit would be fabulous. That's definitely something the administration's put forward. I know there's some discussions going on right now on the Hill about this too. But that would be something, getting the savers credit to be truly refundable, and actually work for lower-income folks would be a huge thing. I know a lot of people have been working for. I know David as well, and Aspen has been interested in this as well. So I think that probably will not happen in this Congress, but something around tax reform would be nice to see. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for coming. This is a great panel, great diversity of perspectives, and a great way to celebrate the victory and start to move forwards. And thank you all for coming. I don't know.